see some people are still joining, but it's 10:31. We're going to go ahead and get started. I first want to thank everybody for attending. This is Perry Corfagna. Thanks for coming in and listening to our Surviving a Cyber Attack, a Business Perspective Part 2. We will be recording this, and we will also have breaks throughout the presentation for Q&A, and we'll have Q&A at the end. So there will be a question and answer pop up for you. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them in there, and we'll be able to see those and take those during breaks throughout the presentation, or also grab them at the end. Any questions, please get them in our Q&A, and Nick will also unmute everyone at the end, so we'll have all lines open from an attendee perspective so you can ask questions then. Dave, if you don't mind, can you go ahead and flip to the next chart, please? For those of you who were unable to attend our first presentation, thanks for joining our second, but I did want to do a very short recap of what we discussed in our first presentation. It was a little bit different format. We had panelists involved. We had Ron Pearson from Hartzell Inc. We had Mike Lockard from Lockard. We had Jill Kindle from Miami Valley Steel, and Walt Sully from Perrysburg Township. They were a fantastic panel. We had executives, obviously, from those companies come in and speak. And really, we were asking them questions, and they were willing to share their experiences, although different experiences of how a breach impacted them, what they thought before the breach, what they did during the breach, how they recovered, and what it meant to the business. And why I wanted to bring that up is I think throughout the 45-minute to hour discussion with our panelists, there were a few highlights. And I think this is important information for the folks on the phone to hear. Again, if you didn't hear the first part, if you did hear the first part, this is probably a refresher. If you didn't, I think it's interesting for you to kind of take some heed to this. Know your cost of downtime. What does that mean? If your systems are down, what does that mean to your business? And that doesn't mean every system you have, but if your phones are out, what does it mean? If your email's out, what if it means, God forbid, but what if your ERP is down? What does that mean from a revenue perspective? What does it mean from a profitability perspective? What does that mean to your employees? And what does that mean to your customers? Keep that in mind. Train your staff. Every person that spoke was definitely focused on training your staff. Make sure your staff understands how to be secure, what security means to your environment, and how to keep up with the latest trends, because this is an ever-changing environment. Have a backup and recovery plan. This is critical. If there is a breach, how do you recover? What do you recover from? So backups become critical. Ensuring backups are encrypted, off-site. There's a variety of things that we discussed, but have a good, solid backup and recovery plan. Have a communication plan. And what does that mean? That's internal and external. If something happens to your organization, how do you communicate that information within your organization and to your clients? Your clients need to know that some of their data could be at risk. You have to report that to them. And you also need your internal staff to understand, how do you communicate within the business? Who do you talk to for what? And what do they need to do if a client reaches out to them? Password policy. We'll talk a little bit about this more today, but I think this was another critical theme that maybe was not ever thought of before, and some of our executives went through this. Having a detailed password policy and following it. It's nice to have a password policy, but if part of the organization doesn't, you're keeping your window open and your entire building is not safe. Everyone is a target. This probably, now that I look at this, should have been the number one bullet, because I don't know that, and I think I could say this freely after speaking with these clients, they may not have thought they would have been a target. We're either too small or not important enough. It doesn't matter. Cyber criminals are out attacking everyone. If they can get a dime, they're going to go capture a dime. Dave, next slide, please. as you saw in the invite, a couple of the things that we want you to think about throughout this presentation are questions that you need to ask. This is kind of the internal discovery of your own organization. Number one, could we recognize if we have a breach? Number two, if there is a breach, how do we respond? Again, from what I mentioned on the earlier component, how do I respond internally and externally? Three, do we understand our business financial risk? Jill spoke in our previous discussion in part one, and I think it's something worth reiterating. Going through this, how helped her understand what the actual financial risk of downtime was. They could not transact business for a short period of time, and those are hundreds of thousands of dollars. How do we protect our most valued assets? That could be your data, that could be your client base, that could be your client's data. That could be any intellectual property within your organization. Are your employees properly trained? The easiest way for cyber criminals to get in is through an employee. Are they properly trained? Do they know what to look for? And could we recover from ransomware? I think that's an important thing to understand. What if? And can you recover quickly? So keep those in mind as we transition. David Reese, our Chief Security Officer and Chief Technology Officer for our technology division, is going to go a little more in depth into the cybersecurity framework and talk about, obviously, the identify stages as we go through this. So thank you again for your time. We appreciate you joining. We know this is an important topic to our clients. And David, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Perry. Thanks, everyone, for attending today. So as we start any journey, whether it's a vacation trip or cybersecurity posture, where do we start? Well, the first one is you need a plan. So having a plan in place gives us a foundation for moving forward. The best way to get where you're going is to use the most direct route, hopefully with the least amount of potholes. So we want to use widely accepted business practices. You might be at the stage of your journey where you're not sure what those best practices are. So we leverage, in our case, what we're going to talk about today is leveraging industry's best efforts, industry and government's best efforts by utilizing the NIST cybersecurity framework. So for those, NIST stands for National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's an organization that's funded by the federal government. They've taken industry experts and built a foundation of information, and that framework that we're going to talk about is the cybersecurity framework, otherwise known as CSF. The framework is one that the federal government mandated several years ago for federal agencies to follow if they were not held to another level of compliance. I look at the cybersecurity framework as a great umbrella for general organizations' security frameworks. If you're in an industry such as healthcare, or you're a DoD subcontractor, financial, you'll have another compliance standard. But if you don't have those compliance frameworks to follow, the cybersecurity framework is a great one to use. So as the graphic on the left shows, this is kind of a never-ending wheel. We start off with identify in the first core function. The next one is protect, and then we cycle through detect, respond, and recover. Now, there are different organizations. They also have established frameworks in place. They're pretty much all destined for the same destination, right? We're all trying to get to a high level of security posture, high levels of security awareness, making sure that we're as protected as feasible in your organizations. Regardless of which one you choose, the outcome should be the same. In this case, we're choosing the cybersecurity framework. Some of the potential business solutions that you may see, things like endpoint security, security operations and incident response, email protection, vulnerability intelligence, and vulnerability management. These types of things are not necessarily in one of those core functions. You might have some of these business solutions to go across functions. The one thing to remember, though, is there's not one magic bullet to just get you where you need to be. There's no bullet train. There are going to be turns in the road. There are going to be maybe some detours. It's a journey. That's the thing to remember. So as we get into the cybersecurity framework, and specifically today, we're talking about identify and protect. We'll get into the detect, respond, and recover in future sessions. But today, we see that each of these core functions have multiple elements within them. Asset management, business environment, et cetera. Protect has several. Again, you're going to have some similarities potentially from one core function to another core function. But the one thing to remember, and it goes back to that picture of the wheel concept on the previous slide, this is a never-ending cycle. So it builds, each core function builds foundational elements that the next core function is going to utilize, so on and so forth. Any questions so far? Okay, so we'll move into the first core function, which is identify. It starts off with asset management. Inventory is the key for asset management. You have to know what you have, and that consists of computers. From a technology perspective now, it consists of computers, the software that you use. You want to try to get the versions of the software packages that you use. You want to look at network components, the other systems that are in process, the facilities, the data, your people that are stakeholders, as well as the processes utilized. A great way to accumulate some of this information is through a network assessment or a network security assessment. Tools that will discover and consolidate this information so you can easily digest it in a report format. Another thing you want to look at is your data flow. Data is an asset, and in some organizations, it may be a key element to the success of their business if it's proprietary information. If you have personally identifiable information, you're in healthcare and you have electronic patient records, you might have controlled unclassified information if you're a DoD subcontractor. That is important information that you are supposed to be protecting. So you have to understand your data flow. And by that, I mean, does it flow outside of your organization to people that are going to ingest that? You might have remote workers. You might have business partners that are going to access that data. What data flows into your environment? So you need to kind of draw those lines of data connectivity to understand where that data resides, where's its home, and then where does it go out to visit. You understand where that data goes, you can then track where it's flowing. Use of external systems. In today's society, so many things are up in the cloud, and it can be confusing for people to understand. If I have Microsoft 365, what's actually at Microsoft's data centers? And where are their data centers? And how do I get my data from the data centers if I want to back it up separate? Well, those are all things that can be uncovered potentially in contracts or agreements with those vendors. You have to understand if maybe you have a hosted ERP system, you have to understand the use of that external system and make sure that you document that. So when you're looking at your inventory and your assets, you understand that that's something you use, but it's not something you have. The next element in this core function is the business environment. As I mentioned, this is not just a technology topic. This specific element in the identify core function is a management-centric component. We need to understand the mission of the organization, the stakeholders, and the activities of the organization. We need to prioritize those and determine the influence that has on everything else that the organization is going to do. And that includes from a technology perspective. If this were a math equation, these would be variables in that equation, and we're trying to solve the equation. So these are going to be interactive with one another. When we get into governance, very similar to like the governor of a state, governance is the oversight and the governing body for things like policies, procedures, compliance, and that could be just a vendor compliance program, or it could be something formal. If you happen to be under the CMMC umbrella for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification that the federal government, the DoD, is now requiring for subcontractors for the Defense Department, they actually will have an audit for that compliance. If you have something like that, you've got people to answer to, governance is going to oversee that. You also have things that can be addressed by legal requirements. If you have a data breach, you've got electronic health records, for instance, that get compromised. There's legal requirements to report that. Environmental changes, operational risks, the governance component is going to oversee those. Then we move on to risk assessment. We go back to the first step of asset discovery and understanding our inventory. Once you know what you have, then you have to look at the risk. We're in a manufacturing-rich environment in this part of the country. It's pretty easy to know what your most required machines are if you're making widgets. From a risk assessment perspective, you can look at that machine and say, I can only tolerate X amount of downtime. You have to do the same risk assessment process for your digital business, the data, the technology, the data processing components. Look at that from the cybersecurity risk. Once you identify those assets, you can do like a tabletop exercise where you have the stakeholders in a room and you talk about the different risks that could pose themselves on the business. Classify those risks and then prioritize them based on the impact it would have in the business operation. It could also be business impact on the legal or compliance requirements of the business. So those things have to be taken into account as well. You need to finally determine the acceptable risk levels. As I mentioned before, if you have this one key machine that's making widgets and it can't be down more than, say, an hour, you need to document that. Then you need to go to those people to keep the machine working and figure out how you can limit your exposure to 1 hour of downtime. Now, if they tell you that it's not feasible because the main thing that breaks takes 4 hours to repair, then you have to take that into your risk management strategies on what you're going to do. Will you have a backup machine? Will you build surplus of stock? You know, those are decisions that have to be worked out. You have to work out those processes and get the stakeholders to agree upon that, because that's going to help build your action plan when an incident occurs. Determine your risk tolerance. So if you can't be down more than an hour, that's going to create some questions for that management stakeholder team to come up with some alternatives. It might affect budgets if you have to buy a second machine so you don't have that business interruption. That's going to be a variable in the equation. That's determined by the management team. That's not coming from your IT department. That's a business management question. Make sure that risk tolerance is clearly expressed so anyone reading your documentation can understand the importance of that component in your business operation. Another thing that's been in the news here recently is supply chain risk management. This was something that was added in believe the last rendition or the last version of the CSF, everyone's probably heard of the SolarWinds Orion attack. A cyber supply chain risk is one that occurs from someone that you typically trust. So if you think of it as your providers, your vendors supply you with something, you trust them, you've got a relationship with them. The threat actors know that. So what they do is they try to compromise someone upstream. What they did in this SolarWinds Orion event was they compromised SolarWinds, the software company. Orion is a network management platform, broadly used through federal government agencies as well as corporate America, medium, small business. They compromised an update server. So SolarWinds clients who were paying their annual maintenance fees to get updated software, those who went out and downloaded that update, unknowingly but willingly installed malware on their server. The threat actors were then able to just wait for that software to check in and say, here I am, and then they had free reign through those networks. That supply chain risk existed because of the trust and vulnerabilities that existed in SolarWinds distribution platform. I like to think in the Midwest we're fairly trusting people. And by default, you have a tendency to trust your vendors. And I'm going to say this a few times throughout the rest of the presentation of zero trust. We have to take this stance as trust no one, prove everything. So in a cybersecurity mindset, you can't trust someone who says they are who they are. You have to continue to ask for additional forms of identification and so forth. So make sure that your team understands that supply chain risk. If you've got a key vendor and something happens and they shut your operations down, you need to identify that and agree. The stakeholders need to agree what level of tolerance is acceptable. And if you need to find alternate providers, then you can do that. Identify those suppliers and third parties, prioritize them, who's our most important one, et cetera. Assess them, ask them the right questions. Are you doing the things to protect your business, which will then protect mine? Look at your contracts. Those can be used to implement appropriate measures in the event that there is supply chain interruption. Routinely assess the supply chain. I'm sure people heard of the Carlisle pipeline ransomware incident. They supplied the majority of fuel to the southeast or east coast. Well, when that source went away, I mean, people on the news were saying there might be rioting, and they had predominantly single source, so they have to go back and look and say, well, is there another way to find an alternate source? I know in our area of the country, for process manufacturing, it's not uncommon to have a reciprocal agreement with another organization that does the same thing you do. So in the event they have a disaster, you'll process for them and so on. We need to do the same thing to protect the supply chain. You need to routinely assess that as well because we're in a changing landscape. So are there any questions so far on Identify?
None right now.
All righty. So we'll take a couple steps back and look at takeaways from the Identify core function. These are some things that can be takeaways from this function for today. Network security assessments will help collect the data that you need. You need to have an understanding of what you have in your environment so you know what to protect and what's supposed to be there. The Carlisle pipeline, they had a situation where threat actor logged into their network. They didn't hack anything. They logged in with an old user account that had not been disabled. They came in as that person who no longer worked there. So doing a network assessment, understanding what your user repository is, look at those users, identify ones that have moved on, disable those accounts. You're going to be working with management meetings. This is not just like the IT guy to do this or the IT person to do this. This is a company effort where it's a journey. So you're going to have management meetings. Make sure that you engage the proper stakeholders, hold each other accountable. Make sure you've got good policies, procedures, and documentation in place. You can't expect people to do the right thing if they don't know what the right thing is. Have it documented so they can follow it, especially when an incident occurs. When you're in an active incident, fire alarms going off, anxiety gets high, the best thing to do is follow the map, right? Follow the documented procedures. This is something that you can review like on an annual basis to make sure it still fits your business and, more importantly, the business goals. Make sure that it meets those acceptable risk levels. Do risk assessments. Uncover new risks that can occur in your business as your business or organization changes, as your vendors may change, product mix, etc. Do risk assessments. Make sure you understand the most important priorities in the organization, and then manage those properly. Okay, let's move over to the next core function, which is protect. So with protect, we're looking at access control as the first element. And just like the inventory where we identified those computers, the devices that are supposed to connect to your network, the people, the users that are supposed to be logging in, we need to be able to manage that identity and the access for and the authentication of those users. So identity management is making sure that these people are who they're supposed to be and only those people that I want to be logging in. So you're checking IDs when they get on the bus, right? So identity management, you're looking at the usernames, authentication, make sure they're who they are. Access control is make sure they're allowed in where they're supposed to be going. If you gave everyone in your organization a key that unlocks every door, it's one access. Everyone is trusted. The problem with that is if something comes up missing, everyone is a suspect. And you may have people that have that master key that don't need it. So you've unfortunately thrown the burden of them being a suspect onto them when they didn't need it, nor they may not desire it. So you have to be careful with how much access you're providing. Wireless, pretty much everyone uses wireless. If you've got a cell phone, it's a wireless device. Wireless access control is extremely important because it's pretty much expected as a ubiquitous method today. If you're using a fixed pre-share key for access via wireless, please strongly consider changing that, because that's the master key mentality. That was fine 10 years ago. It's not really fine today. Wireless access control is being scrutinized because if I can sniff that key out of the air from maybe the parking lot of your organization, I can get on your network. From there, I can start probing and start looking for other ways to compromise machines. So back in the day when we used the physical cable to connect machines, well, those days are pretty much gone. I mean, there are companies that predominantly are wirelessly connected today. You have to be able to control that wireless access. You can do that a couple different ways through either like user-based authentication or certificate-based authentication in a Windows environment. So we'll move on to the next area, awareness training. This is one of my favorites. I think personally that this is probably one of the best ROIs you can get. When I've talked to people that have had compromises, they're like, I can't believe they fell for that. Why did they click on that link? What were they thinking? I would never ask them to go out and buy gift cards. And my response was, did you teach them did you teach them to identify these malicious links? Did you tell them company policy forbids me to ask you to buy anything like that? We have a procurement process. Were they aware? So a lot of times you get in situations where you expect someone to do the right thing, but they don't know what the right thing is. You can't hold them accountable if you don't properly train them. In today's world of cybersecurity readiness, ignorance doesn't work. If you're just going to stick your head in the sand, you're going to be a target. Everyone's a target anyway. But if you stick your head in the sand, you're probably going to be a victim quickly after being a target. Security awareness training platforms can provide practice phishing tests, which will send benign phishing emails to your users so your users can identify those red flags, those links, where you can find out, did the president of the company just send me this? How can I determine if this is a real email? But the first thing you want to do is get the light bulb to go off in their head saying, hey, would this really happen? Why don't I call them or walk down the hall and ask them, did you really want me to go out and buy $6,000 worth of gift cards? Double check. They'll want you to double check. The next area under the protect function is data security. Data security is pretty vague, but basically what we're talking about with data security is just that. How do we keep our finger and our data, our finger on the data and the data locked and secured, consistent with the risk strategy? Now, if I have to share data of some type, and this is why you have to go back to that identify core function and identify the data, because you have to know what you're storing. If I asked you, are you storing payment card information? That's another compliance. PCI DSS, the payment card industry, has a data security standard, and they have guidelines on how credit card information should be stored. So I would say, do you store credit card information? I've had some people say, well, absolutely not. We don't have a need for that. But using tools to go in and look for that information sometimes may find it, because you may not know if you're not doing the inspections. And if the users don't have a policy that says, under no circumstances do you save any credit card information, period, to a computer system, you don't send it in an email, period, then they may actually make the mistake and save it or send it in an email. So you need to make sure that data security processes are consistent with your risk strategy and your policies. CIA, it's not the Central Intelligence Agency. In data security, it means confidentiality. This is shown, by the way, if you look up CIA and cybersecurity or data security, you'll see an image of a triangle, because a triangle is the strongest geometric shape. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Having those three things builds a solid foundation for your data security. Confidentiality is protecting the data to make sure it's only available to those who need it. Least privileged access is a key component of that. Integrity. Make sure that the data cannot be modified inappropriately. Make sure that it's consistent and it's not damaged. And then availability. Make sure that the data is available to the people that need it when they need it. Make sure your systems can provide that confidentiality, integrity, and availability to meet the business requirements. And then finally, when we take that data and we start to move it, we need to make sure that it's secure in its transfer, and it's also encrypted. Today with the pandemic, I mean, we've got a few things that have turned the apple cart over, but with remote workers, you need to make sure that all of the communications for that remote worker is done through a virtually private network utilizing encryption. The next one leads us into information protection. Now, in a similar fashion to data security, we're now looking at protecting the information, and it's similar to data security, but from a different perspective. There are ways that we can protect the information, not necessarily talking about the data, but more of the protective measures. So security management. How do I watch things that could be trying to affect the data and impact the data security? So you have to have security management elements, processes and procedures to protect the data. Make sure that people understand those processes and procedures, have them well documented so they understand this process. I have this type of data. I have to follow this process to protect it. And then vulnerability management. Vulnerability management starts, first off, with identifying what software is running. Kind of goes back to that identify function again, the asset management. Understanding and identifying what software you have running, along with the versions of that software, help with matching that up with a vendor-provided database of bugs or vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities, when they're released to the public, they are also released to the hackers. The hackers can see those vulnerabilities and then basically go after those vulnerabilities. So what they're doing to yours and our network on a daily basis is looking for vulnerable points of entry. If you have public-facing computers, like websites, it might be an email server that has Outlook Web Access so people can get to webmail. It might be a server to do a remote desktop session, something like that. When software gets developed, frankly, all software has bugs, right? Humans make software. Humans aren't perfect, so software is not perfect. When vulnerabilities are found, they're recorded into a vulnerability database. That vulnerability database is used by tools to identify the software and see if that software is vulnerable to certain exploits. When they're identified in a vulnerability assessment, the vulnerability management has to kick in. In other words, patching. You need to make sure that you mitigate that risk by patching the software. I myself have been in situations where you've got software running for a business application and maybe you can't get it upgraded for one reason or another. And then you have to look at the vulnerabilities to see what your risk is. Go back to your risk assessment, your risk management, and determine, is this more risk than I want? Do I need to shut off certain types of access? Do I need to change the access method? As an example, maybe I need to require a VPN connection before I can get a session to this one host. Because the host itself, if I open it up for public access, it can be compromised because of the vulnerabilities. And I can't upgrade the software because the vendor says it'll break something else. So if you see my point, you could be between that rock and a hard place. So you have to come up with a method, and this is part of that security management, is to come up with a process and a procedure to protect that data. It might be different than how you did it yesteryear, but it's a constantly evolving landscape. We see vulnerabilities released every day. Things like Chrome, things like Microsoft Windows with this print nightmare about the print spooler. You probably heard of the Microsoft Exchange Day Zero vulnerability, which was the Hafnium exploit. With vulnerability management, you need to stay on top of that, make sure you have good patching policies in place. When we go and talk about maintenance, we're talking essentially like third-party maintenance and repairs. This is something that penetration testers and hackers may use to get into your organization. The bug guy shows up to come and spray for bugs, and he's not really the bug guy, but people say, oh, there's the bug guy, okay. Make sure that all your maintenance repairs are approved and they're logged, and if necessary, they're chaperoned. Make sure that those repairs are performed in a consistent, controlled manner. Make sure that changes follow a change management protocol. Make sure you've got proper maintenance windows in place and that you can classify the change required. If it's an emergency, for instance, you're just going to make that change. If it's just a maintenance update, make sure that that gets scheduled appropriately and log those changes. So when something it doesn't act normal, you can look at your environment and say, okay, what changed? And you know where to go back to roll that back. The other consideration is, as a third party may come into your business to perform service, make sure that you control their access to your environment. It's not uncommon for a penetration tester, and these are usually social engineering people as well. They'll try to gain access to your organization so they can connect the device. So they may get into the building and plug something in under a desk. They might, plug into a wall jack or get into a computer closet. They're trying to compromise your business. It's not just somebody that's in a hoodie in a basement. So they may engineer their way inside the building by posing as a repairman or a pest control, something like that. Then we get into protective technologies. This is really when we're talking about the technologies involved to do things like log audits. So when we have situations where we've got a device like a firewall, a Windows machine that generates event logs when things happen, different things happen in the environment, it keeps a log of all that. No different than if you're driving through, the Southwest and you want to keep a logbook or a journal of everything that you've seen, or nowadays we take pictures on our phones. You want to maintain audit logs of everything that's happening. You need to determine, again, based on your risk, acceptable risk, that inventory, what do you need to keep logs for? Determine how long you need them, and that can be tied to compliance requirements, legal requirements, and then implement those logs in such a way that they're protected. If it's required that the logging is off-site, those are factors in the equation, again, that need to be considered. Another protective technology we need to look at is encryption in a good way. We want to encrypt like removable media. If you have to have data privacy, make sure that you've got a platform in place that can protect that data when it goes to a USB memory stick or perhaps an external USB drive. You might have people that decide they want to back up their computer, so they're going to bring their backup drive in from home and hook it up and do those backups. You need to make sure that that meets company policy. You may not permit personal devices to be connected, especially if it's not being encrypted, because they could be taking sensitive data off-site without your knowledge. So protecting the media is extremely important. Things like Windows BitLocker, on the Mac you have File Vault. There are other systems that manage and oversee the encryption of the devices, and it can maintain these encryption keys so that in the event the user gets locked out or whatever, and you need to get that decryption key, you can decrypt. It's also wise in certain areas, certain business types, to encrypt data on your workstations. I could take a laptop, take the drive out of the laptop, and I could put it in a dock, a USB dock connected to another machine, and I can read all the data on that drive. So even if I can't log into Windows, I can still get to the data. If you encrypt it, then I can't, unless I have the decryption key. So that has to be managed. Encryption is a good thing in this case. And then we also want to look at encrypting our communication and control networks. Make sure those are protected whenever possible. Isolate them either via encryption or through VPN. Even if you've got computer-controlled shop floor machines in a manufacturing environment, that can be your bread and butter. If those machines get compromised or those machines go down, you stop processing, that can be an issue. So let's take one step back and look at some takeaways. Scrutinize your AD logins and your permissions. again, from the network security assessment perspective, identify those users that it says are active, look at them, compare that with your actual employee listing, then look at permissions. Make sure that people have the permissions that they should have and not just these master keys. Multi-factor authentication, if you're not using it today, I implore you, put it on everything you can. It is a fantastic leap forward in protecting your accounts. Business email compromise is rampant right now, especially if you have Microsoft 365. It's cloud accessible. If you don't have multi-factor authentication on it, do it. Really quick, username password is one factor. Have you ever giving your password to somebody that needs to log into your computer? Maybe somebody work on your computer to fix a problem and you give them your password. Did you change it right away when they were done? Have you used a password to multiple sites? Do you use summer 21 exclamation point with a capital S, of course? These passwords are being found on the dark web. They have millions of passwords and dictionaries that the hackers are using. Two-factor authentication adds something that you have. So something is a password. If you give your password to someone else, now someone else knows it. If they post it on the dark web, a lot of people know it. Something you have is like a small, like a key fob with a number on it. You can get applications to go on your cell phone, and they increment typically a 6-digit number for about a minute, and that gets matched up to this login process. So, for instance, Microsoft 365, if I go to log in, it's going to ask me for my username, my password, and then it's going to pop up and say, okay, you need to enter your two-factor authentication. And then I have to put in that PIN, or maybe it's going to push a notification to my phone and say, do you accept or decline? And it's going to tell me what the application is for and where the request is coming from. It's going to try to identify the geography of that IP address that was making the request. Multi-factor authentication starts to add the device that you're authenticating from. So it could be just company devices. Then you can add things like the geo-IP fencing, where they can only come in from certain areas of Ohio or a specific radius of a location. Multi-factor authentication, put it on all remote access methods you have, and put it on all hosted applications like Microsoft 365 or hosted ERP systems wherever possible. Train your people. Again, train your people. You can't hold them accountable to do the right thing if they don't know what the right thing is. Least privileged access, this is a little bit sensitive. I'll say this the best I can. If the president of the company doesn't need full-blown access to everything in their daily user account, don't give it to them. Give them an admin account. I personally do not have admin rights to our network with my daily user account, nor do I want to, because if my account is compromised, someone has keys to the kingdom. I have a separate account that I log in with that gives me admin privileges. So use the least privileged access. Don't give people access if they don't need it. Because, again, you're putting a burden on them, whether they know it or not, that they don't necessarily need. And in a lot of cases, they don't want. Manage change. Manage vendors. Make sure their change management is under control and that changes occur that are reviewed and approved, and your vendor management is clean. And you've got your vendors doing the right thing, doing their cybersecurity awareness just as well as you are. And then finally, disk encryption. You can enable things like BitLocker on your Windows machines, especially those people that travel. In the event that they lose a computer, you have to know what data is on that computer. Implement VPNs. A note here, if you've got VPNs that have been in place for quite some time, it's very possible that they're currently using a deprecated encryption protocol, a weaker encryption algorithm that has been since deprecated and is recommended to use a stronger one. In most cases, it's a matter of maybe a software update or a reconfiguration. In other cases, if it's a very old device, it may not have the horsepower to do that. so it might require a hardware upgrade. XDR is extended detection and response. Essentially, that's the next generation of antivirus programs. The hackers have figured out, it's a cat and mouse game, they've figured out how to circumvent most antivirus programs before they drop their malware and their ransomware. The extended detection and response software gives us extra tools and extra layers of protection to stop that or roll it back if it does happen. It used to be, if you came in and you were a malware program, you were a spotted zebra. So it looked for spotted zebras and said, oh, there it is. Then it evolved to what the program did. So it was like if you had an application of malware that was trying to modify a Windows system file, the endpoint protection software would go, aha, not supposed to modify system files. Stop it. Well, now the threat actors are using legitimate tools, legitimate Windows management tools like PowerShell, for instance, to launch these attacks. So the methodologies to stop those types of attacks has evolved into the extended detection and response software programs. And finally, BCDR, obviously I had to finish it with another acronym, business continuity and disaster recovery. In the event of a disaster, whether it's a fire, tornado, ransomware, whatever, if you've lost your data, the most important thing is not your backups. It is the restoration. Test your restores. Make sure that your restores, your backup data, is air-gapped and not accessible from the network. You want to have it so if the threat actors get on your network, they can't get to your backup storage. So have that off-sided, make sure that you can recover it, test those restores, and assure that business continuity. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. Do you have any questions queued up?
We do not have any pending questions. Here we go. I believe the participants, if they do have any questions, they should be able to unmute themselves if they have any questions.
Excellent.
Hey, Dave, can you hear me?
Yes.
Maybe question/statement. Met with quite a few clients, and we've had this discussion around NIST and cybersecurity framework. And one of the, I would say, overarching themes or things that come up quite often is, okay, I'm going to go do this. I'm going to work with Perry Protect to help me go through this process. Am I now considered compliant? Can you add a little commentary around that?
Well, certainly. So compliance is measured in certain industries, typically is done by an auditor. So when you look at like the cybersecurity framework, there's not like a certificate that you would get for a cybersecurity framework. What you will get is the understanding that you're doing your due diligence to protect your organization, your employees, your customers, your vendors, etc. In the state of Ohio, there is a Safe Harbor Act that went through, and it basically says that if you have confidential information, like personally identifiable information, and it is leaked through a data breach, then you're legally liable to report that. It also states that if you can prove through your documented processes and your logging that you are doing these best practices, and you can prove that you're executing to the cybersecurity framework as an example, that you'll be held harmless because you're following that acceptable framework and you're doing your due diligence. So you can't be sued for that, essentially. Now, if you can't prove that you're doing these things and you basically are just saying, yeah, we do it, think we do it, maybe we do it, not sure, then there's grounds. And at that point, you could be sued for having that information released. Good question, though. Any others?
I don't see any other questions. I think we're good.
Well, I want to thank everyone for their attendance. I do want to remind you that we only went over the first two. No way that we could have gone over all five and been able to stay through it. That would have been a challenge. Future sessions will be going over the detect, the respond, and the recover. And we'll go into those areas. But thanks for your attendance, everyone. And we will have a recording of this that will be posted as soon as we get it produced. We'll watch for that. So thanks for your attendance and have a great day.